we will be talking about the cutting instructions, and I did post those in the Facebook group, so you have all the information you need to get all your pieces cut out so that next week you'll be ready to start doing the sewing portion. But I have some new people here in the group, and since this is week one, I thought we'd talk about some of the basics for you first. Some of the tools that I use regularly for cutting are my 8.5 by 24, this big guy with a handle. You see this in the shop if you come and buy fabric from us. This is what we're using in the store. Handle just makes it easier to keep that pressure right in the middle and not have all that shift and movement when you're trying to cut. And it's just great for cutting long strips. Then my next best friend for rulers is this guy, the 6.5 by 12.5 creative grid. It's just your standard cutting for most pieces you need. Unless you start working in really big blocks, this gets you just about everything. Then of course, if you've done any of my sew-alongs, participated in a lot of my classes or seen my videos, you see a little baby 4.5 by 8.5. Oh my God, this is almost my best friend. This sits by my sewing machine with my cutting mat there for a lot of my trimming because a lot of my blocks are smaller. So I like this little guy. So those are my 3 most common rulers. Like if you only let me have 3, these would be it. The rest, forget it. So definitely, if you're curious about any of them, you can come see us at the shop. You can go on our website, just look up Creative Grids. We have all kinds of them because Creative Grids definitely are my most favorite, mostly because they have a grippy texture on the back. Can't really see from this camera, but there's little circles of grip spots. And then what's nice also is there's kind of a 1/2 inch marking on one side. There's definitely that 1/4 inch marking on the other side when you're trimming up your seam allowances. One direction is whole numbers. If you flip it, another direction is the 1/2 inch increments. It just covers all your bases. You have your 45, your 30, your 60. It's just got everything. It's even got essentially a flying geese lineup trim tool in the middle of this one. So you don't get any better than these rulers. For this week though, I am also going to encourage the simple folded corners ruler. I talked about it in my Monday tips. This is one of my favorite specialty rulers for adding on like rectangular strips that you're merging together. So not just half square triangles, but actual more like flying geese and those kind of blocks where you're adding on more awkward pieces or you're putting 2 fabrics right sides together at a 90-degree angle, some of those kind of weird things that you do. This helps you avoid drawing a bunch of lines. So if you want more detail about that, go to our YouTube, go find the Mindy's Monday Mayhem tips. For earlier this week, it would have been February 1st version. And I give you more detailed instructions on that ruler. So for this sew along, I do recommend this guy because you're going to do a lot of funky adding of fabrics. And that way you don't have to draw lines. Just forget that friction pen, that marking tool, don't need it. You're going to use that and be happy because it'll do your trimming and get you ready for your seam allowance all in one step. As far as prepping fabric for cutting, I don't talk about it very often. So like I said, we're going to go over some basics. How I prep fabric, a lot of times I use a combination of best press and flatter. Okay, I take an empty bottle like this guy because I've used it all up. I have where I'll fill 1/3 of best press, 1/3 of flatter, and 1/3 of water because I'm a heavy sprayer. I do a lot of spraying, and that just kind of helps dilute it all together and not get too starchy with my starch spray. So this is my go-to if I like my fabrics to be nice and firm, easy to work with, and I definitely use it when my blocks are done. Anytime I finish a block, this is what gets sprayed on and ironed with it. Okay. Otherwise, basics for prepping. So a lot of people ask, they cut strips and they turn wavy. So what I learned long ago back in the beginning, if I'm taking full width of fabric, so most fabrics are about 40, 42, 45 from end to end. So from selvage edge to selvage edge. Okay. I take those 2 edges and I'll line them up. Now what I try to make sure, because even though we cut them off We measure it off the bolt a certain way. You can't always tell if it's kind of on that bolt wonky. It doesn't always get put on the bolt nice and clean, which is very frustrating. So when you get home, it may not be nice and clean. So hopefully you can tell. See, my selvages line up. This is how it was cut. When I get to the bottom, and I don't know if you're going to be able to tell on this fabric, but it has a little bit of twist to it down in there. Okay, if you see where the little buckle in it is. So that's how you kind of get wonky, because the fabric isn't actually straight. So what I end up doing is taking my selvages and I start shifting. So I use my fingers up here and I shift it until down where the fold is, I no longer have that buckle. It's nice and smooth. I'll then go iron it, because that's how I know it should be about the straightest of grain I'm going to be able to get it. And then you should have less curvature in your strips. So then you just go, you iron it, and then bring it back to your cutting mat, get ready to cut your strips. I try most of the time to cut the full section of fabric that's folded in half. You can, if you're working on a smaller mat, take your fabric and then fold it again to cut strips. You just have a higher chance of getting more wave in there. It's doable. If you're working in a small space, it's just what you got to do. And that's okay, as long as you've lined things up. If you've lined it so you don't have a twist in the fold, and then you take your selvages and you match them to your nice straight fold, you still should have a pretty straight of grain. About as, like I said, as good as you're going to get. But if you have the space, definitely lay it out as much as possible. I'm going to move my camera and I'll show you how I cut strips, just so you know, in case you need to know. Otherwise, those of you that know what you're doing, go find the instructions and get cutting, okay? You don't need to listen to me, because I'm just giving you basics. There's no really any other tips and tricks for the cutting portion. Cut your strips per the instructions, and you'll end up with lots of pretty stacks, like these, okay? Big stacks. This is the throw size. Look at these stacks of fabric. So you can go be free. Otherwise, if you need some help getting those straighter strips, stick with me. We're going to move this camera. Hopefully not very good. Get you that cutting mat here. See if we can see most of it. If you see a dog in the background, I apologize. They're never ending. Okay, so here I have my nice straightened fold. There's no tweak in it, okay? I have my lovely 24.5-inch ruler, so it is definitely longer than the length of my fabric. Okay, so I'm lining up a straight line on the bottom. Doesn't matter which one, just pick a straight line, match it to your fold, and then trim off the edge. So you have a nice clean edge. Make that guy go away, okay? And then I turn it, and I try to make sure that edge doesn't shift. That is the hardest part of this whole task, is making sure that this edge that I just cleaned up doesn't get away with me. Okay, and then what I love, so for this pattern we're doing 2.5-inch strips. So like I said, this ruler has whole numbers and half numbers. So I just flip it for whichever I want to do. So since we're doing 2.5, I have that, and that's lining up on the edge of the fabric. Oh, and I didn't give you my PSA. My PSA is you never use the mat to measure your cuts. Just don't do it, because mats are not consistent. And sometimes some lines are wider than others, and it just, you don't get as good as results as you would with using your ruler. So just so you know, if you're in a class with me, I'm going to tell you every time you have to cut with a ruler, or you get those dirty looks from me that are like, no, let's teach you. Unless, of course, you're working in a very large square that's bigger than any ruler you own, then yes, the mat is what you're going to have to use, and just accept that that's what's going to happen. So I have my hand on my ruler here, nice dead center, cut 2.5-inch strip, okay, and I just pull it away. All right, and then I keep going. So I try not to shift this fabric very much. Now I will continue to cut till about 3 times. Once till I get to my 3rd cut, then I will re-clean it up. So we're going to pretend if that was the third cut, move those out of my way, I would turn it back around, trim it up again, because no matter how hard you try, no matter how sticky your ruler is and how good your hand grip is, things just shift and curve. So I'll turn it back around and then I trim it back up. I did pretty good. I really didn't need to trim, but like I said, usually by the third time, maybe fourth, at least check it. Make sure this line is still straight so that as you're cutting your strips, they are the straightest they possibly can be, so that you aren't calling me going, why are my strips wavy? Okay, so that's my basic cutting tips. And then all I do, because you'll cut a strip and then you'll cross cut, right? So sometimes I'll stack. If you're new, don't stack. If you're a little more experienced, feel free, you can stack. This is where my little rulers come in. This is where I come in and I have these all lined up. All the edges are straight. I just take one line on one straight edge of this strip set, chop off the selvage. Never put a selvage in a quilt. It's woven a little differently. It'll act differently in your quilt. Just, unless you're doing an actual selvage quilt, don't use it, okay? Trim it off. And then some of the strips are, say, 4.5. So I have, this is 4.5 inches wide. So I have the far left edge on the strip, the side of the strip that I just trimmed. I have this line across the bottom to make sure I'm keeping everything straight. And I cut 4.5. Some of the strips are, say, like a 6.5. So then what I do is I turn my ruler the other way. And it doesn't matter which ruler. I can use this big guy. Doesn't matter. All I make sure that I do is that the 6.5 is on the clean end there, and that I have a solid line on the bottom. So I'm essentially lining up 90 degrees with this strip set to make sure it's as clean as possible. If you see that this edge starts to kick out for whatever reason, because you twisted or whatever, go back to the same step, clean it up. See, and I've got some trying to shift on me, so I'm just going to straighten it back up. But yeah, you just start back with this step of going, lining up a straight line on the bottom, trimming off that edge, and then turning around and cutting again. That's all it is. It gets very methodical. You just keep going and going until all your cutting's done. Okay, make sure you have good new blades. I need to change mine. Especially once you get a nick in it, please change your blade. It's just time to do it. Understand that if you do not change your blades very often, if you wait a long time, you will start to wear out your mat. It is not healthy for your mat. So you'll start getting grooves and things because you're working with a dull blade. It just does actually damage to your mat and wears your blade down even more. So changing it is definitely healthy, and it's just good practice. So that's all I have as tips for cutting. Okay, guys? So come back here. Ooh, kind of liking my new tool. All right, so that's cutting for this week. That's all you're doing. You're cutting your strips, and then you're subcutting your strips into stacks. Large stacks if you're doing throw size or bigger. You're going to have a lot of pieces. So get ready. This is not one of your easier quilts. It's not super complicated. Don't freak out. But it's not like uber beginner basic, whip it out in a day quilt. Okay? But hopefully you'll like it in the end. It's a fun design. I really like it. So hopefully you'll stick with me this whole month and we'll get it done. It'll be great. But that's all you need to do. So cut your stacks and get ready for next week. And next week will be week 1 of sewing together section of the blocks. And remember, it's a mystery. You don't know what it looks like till the very end. Oh, and I did have questions in the group about directional. If you're worried about directional, then my recommendation is keep your fabric going lengthwise. So keep your direction going this way, because that's how the fabric's going to lay in this quilt. It's not going to be in the quilt going this direction. So if you're working with directional, definitely keep in mind, keep your fabric going through the length, okay? That's my only tip I'm going to give you as to what's going on with this guy. Otherwise, I tell you, just let it go. Now's the time, let it go, or don't use directional if you think it's going to freak you out. Find something that doesn't read quite as directional. And if it's just a design that you think is kind of reads directional, but it's not like stripe, it should be fine. It shouldn't matter which way it's going in this quilt. But just keep in mind, if it's super directional, it'll bug you. Keep it going this way with your strips. Okay, that's all my tips for this week. So hopefully you'll get it all ready, and next Friday we'll be back here at an earlier time because I just had conflict with another sew along. So we'll be at 3 o'clock next week. Okay, guys? So have a fabulous Friday and a great weekend of cutting, and we'll see you next week. Happy stitching.